The Cosmic Computer. Original title, Junkyard Planet by H. Beam Piper. Chapter 1, 30 Minutes to Litchfield. Con Maxwell, at the armor-glass front of the observation deck, watched the landscape rush out of the horizon and vanish beneath the ship, 10,000 feet down. He thought he knew how an hourglass must feel with the sand slowly draining out. It had been 6 months to Litchfield when the Mizar lifted out of La Plata spaceport, and he watched Terra dwindle away. It had been 2 months to Litchfield when he boarded the city of Asgard at the port of the same name on Odin. It had been 2 hours to Litchfield when the Countess Dorothy rose from the airship dock at Storaysend. He had had all that time, and now it was gone, and he was still unprepared for what he must face at home. 30 minutes to Litchfield. The words echoed in his mind as though he had spoken them aloud, and then, realizing that he never addressed himself as Sir, he turned. It was the first mate. He had a clipboard in his hand, and he was wearing a Terran Federation Space Navy uniform of 40 years, or about a dozen regulation changes, ago. Once Khan had taken that sort of thing for granted, now it was obtruding upon him everywhere. 30 minutes to Litchfield, sir, the first officer repeated and gave him the clipboard to check the luggage list. Valises, 2. Trunks, 2. Microbookcase, 1. The last item fanned a small flicker of anger, not at any person, not even at himself, but at the whole infernal situation. He nodded. That's everything. Not many passengers left aboard, are there? You're the only one first class, sir. About 40 farm laborers on the lower deck. He dismissed them as mere cargo. Litchfield's the end of the run. I know. I was born there. The mate looked again at his name on the list and grinned. Sure, you're Rodney Maxwell's son. Your father's been giving us a lot of freight lately. I guess I don't have to tell you about Litchfield. Maybe you do. I've been away for 6 years. Tell me, are they having labor trouble now? Labor trouble? The mate was surprised. You mean with the farm tramps? 10 of them for every job, if you call that trouble. Well, I noticed you have steel gratings over the gangway heads to the lower deck, and all your crewmen are armed. Not just pistols, either. Oh, that's on account of pirates. Pirates? Khan echoed. Well, I guess you'd call them that. A gang'll come aboard, dressed like farm tramps. They'll have Tommy guns and sawed-off shotguns in their bindles. When the ship's airborne and out of reach of help, they'll break out their guns and take her. Usually kill all the crew and passengers. They don't like to leave live witnesses, the mate said. You heard about the Harriet barn, didn't you? She was transcontinent and overseas, the biggest contragravity ship on the planet. They didn't pirate her, did they? The mate nodded. 6 months ago, Blackie Perril's gang. There was just a tag end of a radio call that ended in a shot. Time the air patrol got to her estimated position, it was too late. Nobody's ever seen ship, officers, crew, or passengers since. Well, great goo. Isn't the government doing anything about it? Sure. They offered a big reward for the pirates, dead or alive. And there hasn't been a single case of piracy inside the city limits of Storaysend, he added solemnly. The Calder Range had grown to a sharp blue line on the horizon ahead, and he could see the late afternoon sun on granite peaks. Below, the fields were bare and brown, and the woods were autumn-tinted. They had been green with new foliage when he had last seen them, and the wine melon fields had been in pink blossom. Must have gotten the crop in early on this side of the mountains. Maybe they were still harvesting, over in the Gordon Valley. Or maybe this gang below was going to the wine pressing. Now that he thought of it, he'd seen a lot of cask staves going aboard at Storaysend. Yet there seemed to be less land under cultivation now than 6 years ago. He could see squares of bracken and low brush that had been melon fields recently, among the new forests that had grown up in the past 40 years. The few stands of original timber towered above the second growth like hills. Those trees had been there when the planet had been colonized. That had been 200 years ago, at the beginning of the 7th century, atomic era. The name, Poiktesmi, told that's a romanticist movement when they were rediscovering James Branch Cable. Old Genji Gartner, the scholarly and half-piratical space rover, whose ship had been the first to enter the trisystem, had been devoted to the romantic writers of the pre-atomic era. He had named all the planets of the Alpha system from the books of Cable, and those of Beta from Spencer's Fairy Queen, and those of Gamma from Rabelais. Of course, the camp village at his first landing site on this one had been called Storisend. 30 years later, Genji Gartner had died there, after seeing Storisend grow to a metropolis and Poiktesmi become a member republic in the Terran Federation. The other planets were uninhabitable except in airtight dome cities, but they were rich in minerals. Companies had been formed to exploit them. No food could be produced on any of them except by carniculture and hydroponic farming, and it had been cheaper to produce it naturally on Poiktesmi. So Poiktesmi had concentrated on agriculture and had prospered, at least for about a century. Other colonial planets were developing their own industries. The manufactured goods the Gartner trisystem produced could no longer find a profitable market. The mines and factories on Jurgen and Koshche, on Britomart and Calidor, on Panurge and the moons of Pantagruel closed, and the factory workers went away. On Poiktesmi, the offices emptied, the farms contracted, forests reclaimed fields, and the wild game came back. Coming toward the ship out of the east now was a vast desert of crumbling concrete landing fields and parade grounds, empty barracks and toppling sheds, airship docks, stripped gun emplacements, and missile launching sites. These were more recent and dated from Poiktesmi's second hectic prosperity, when the Gartner trisystem had been the advance base for the 3rd Fleet Army Force during the System States War. It had lasted 12 years. Millions of troops were stationed on or routed through Poiktesmi. The mines and factories reopened for war production. The Federation spent trillions on trillions of souls, piled up mountains of supplies and equipment, left the face of the world cluttered with installations. Then, without warning, the System States Alliance collapsed, the rebellion ended, and the scourge of peace fell on Poiktesmi. The Federation armies departed. They took the clothes they stood in, their personal weapons, and a few souvenirs. Everything else was abandoned. Even the most expensive equipment had been worth less than the cost of removal. The people who had grown richest out of the war had followed, taking their riches with them. For the next 40 years, those who remained had been living on leavings. On Terra, Khan had told his friends that his father was a prospector, leaving them to interpret that as one who searched, say, for uranium. Rodney Maxwell found quite a bit of uranium, but he got it by taking apart the warheads of missiles. Now, he was looking down on the granite spines of the Calder Range. Ahead, the misty Gordon Valley sloped and widened to the north. 20 minutes to Litchfield now. He still didn't know what he was going to tell the people who would be waiting for him. No, he knew that. He just didn't know how. The ship swept on, 10 miles a minute, tearing through thin puffs of cloud. 10 minutes. The Big Bend was glistening redly in the sunlit haze, but Litchfield was still hidden inside its curve. 6. 4. The Countess Dorothy was losing speed and altitude. Now he could see it, first a blur and then distinctly. The airline's building, so thick as to look squat for all its height. The yellow block of the distilleries under their plume of steam. High Garden Terrace, the mall. Moment by moment, the stigmata of decay became more evident. Terraces empty or littered with rubbish. Gardens untended and choked with wild growth. Blank-staring windows, walls splotched with lichens. At first, he was horrified at what had happened to Litchfield in 6 years. Then he realized that the change had been in himself. He was seeing it with new eyes, as it really was. The ship came in 500 feet above the mall, and he could see cracked pavements sprouting grass, statues askew on their pedestals, waterless fountains. At first he thought one of them was playing, but what he had taken for spray was dust blowing from the empty basin. There was a thing about dusty fountains, some poem he'd read at the university. The fountains are dusty in the graveyard of dreams. The hinges are rusty, they swing with tiny screams. Was Poectesme a graveyard of dreams? No, junkyard of empire. The Terran Federation had impoverished 100 planets, devastated a score, actually depopulated at least 3, to keep the system states' alliance from seceding. It hadn't been a victory. It had only been a lesser defeat. There was a crowd, almost a mob, on the dock, nearly everybody in topside Litchfield. He spotted old Colonel Zerf with his white hair and plum-brown skin, and Tom Brangwyn, the town marshal, red-faced and bulking above everybody else. Kurt Fawsey, the mayor, well to the front. Then he saw his father and mother and his sister Flora and waved to them. They waved back, and then everybody was waving. The gangway port opened, and the Academy band struck up, enthusiastically if inexpertly, as he descended to the dock. His father was wearing a black suit with a long coat, cut to the same pattern as the one he had worn 6 years ago. Blackout curtain cloth. It was fairly new, but the coat had begun to acquire a permanent wrinkle across the right hip, over the pistol butt. His mother's dress was new, and so was Flora's, made for the occasion. He couldn't be sure just which of the Federation armed forces had provided the material, but his father's shirt was med-service sterilin. Ashamed to be noticing things like that, he clasped his father's hand, kissed his mother, embraced his sister. There were a few, but very few, gray threads in his father's mustache, a few more squintrinkles around the eyes. His mother's hair was all gray now, and she was heavier. She seemed shorter, but that would be because he'd grown a few inches in the last 6 years. For a moment, he was surprised that Flora actually looked younger. Then he realized that to 17, 23 is practically middle age, but to 23, 29 is almost contemporary. He noticed the glint on her left hand and caught it to look at the ring. "Hey, Zarathustra Sunstone." "Nice," he said. "Where is he, sis?" He'd never met her fiancé. Wade Lucas hadn't come to Litchfield to practice medicine until the year after he'd gone to Terra. "Oh, emergency," Flora said. "Obstetrical case. That won't wait on anything. In Tramptown, of course, but he'll be at the party." "Oops, I shouldn't have said that. That's supposed to be a surprise." "Don't worry, I'll be surprised," he promised. Then Kurt Fawsey was pushing forward, holding out his hand. Thinner and grayer, but just as effusive as ever. "Welcome home, Con, Judge. Shake hands with him and tell him how glad we all are to see him back. Now, France, put away the recorder. Save the interview for the Chronicle till later." "Ah, Professor Kelton, one pupil Litchfield Academy can be proud of." He shook hands with them. Judge Ledoux, France Veltrin, old Professor Dolph Kelton. They were all happy. How much, he wondered, because he was Con Maxwell, Rodney Maxwell's son, home from Terra, and how much because of what they hoped he'd tell them. Kurt Fawsey, edging him aside, was the first to speak of it. "Con, what did you find out?" he whispered. "Do you know where it is?" He stammered, then saw Tom Brangwyn and Colonel Clem Zerf approaching, the older man tottering on a silver-headed cane and the younger keeping pace with him. Neither of them had been born on Poectesme. Tom Brangwyn had always been reticent about where he came from, but Hathor was a good guess. There had been political trouble on Hathor 20 years ago. The losers had had to get off-planet in a hurry to dodge firing squads. Clem Zerf never was reticent about his past. He came from Ashmedai, one of the system state's planets, and he had commanded a regiment, and finally a division that had been blasted down to less than regimental strength in the Alliance Army. He always wore a little rosette of system states black and green on his coat. "Hello, boy," he croaked, extending a hand. Good to see you again. It sure is, Con, the town marshal agreed, then lowered his voice. Find out anything definite? We didn't have much time, Con, Kurt Fozzie said, but we've arranged a little celebration for you. We'll start it with a dinner at Senta's. You couldn't have done anything I'd have liked better, Mr. Fozzie. I'd have to have a meal at Senta's before I'd really feel at home. Well, it'll be a couple of hours. Suppose we all go up to my office in the meantime. Give the ladies a chance to fix up for the party and have a little drink and a talk together. You want to do that, Con? His father asked. There was an odd undernote of anxiety or reluctance in his voice. Yes, of course. I'd like that. His father turned to speak to his mother and Flora. Kurt Fozzie was speaking to his wife, interrupting himself to shout instructions to some laborers who were bringing up a contragravity skid. Con turned to Colonel Zerf. Good melon crop this year? He asked. The old rebel cursed. Gehenna of a big crop, we're up to our necks in melons. This time next year we'll be washing our feet in brandy. Hold on to it and age it. You ought to see what they charge for a drink of Poiktesmi brandy on Terra. This isn't Terra, and we aren't selling it by the drink, Colonel Zerf said. We're selling it at Storisend Spaceport for what the freighter captains pay us. You've been away too long, Con. You've forgotten what it's like to live in a poor house. The cargo was coming off now, cask staves and more cask staves. Zerf swore bitterly at the sight, and then they started toward the wide doors of the shipping floor inside the airline's building. Outgoing cargo was beginning to come out. Casks of brandy, of course, and a lot of boxes and crates, painted light blue and bearing the yellow trefoil of the 3rd Fleet Army Force and the 8-pointed red star of ordnance. Cases of rifles, square boxes of ammunition, crated autocannon. Con turned to his father. This our stuff? He asked. Where did you dig it? Rodney Maxwell laughed. You know the old 10th Army headquarters, over back of Snagtooth, in the Calders? Everybody knows that was cleaned out years ago. Well, always take a second look at these things everybody knows. 10 to 1 they're not so. It always bothered me that nobody found any underground attack shelters. I took a second look, and sure enough, I found them, right underneath, mined out of the solid rock. Con, you'd be surprised at what I found there. Where are you going to sell that stuff? He asked, pointing at a passing skid. There's enough combat equipment around now to outfit a private army for every man, woman, and child in Poiktesmi. Storisend Spaceport. The freighter captains buy it and sell it on some of the planets that were colonized right before the war and haven't gotten industrialized yet. I'm clearing about 200 souls a ton on it. The skid at which he had pointed was loaded with cases of M504 submachine guns. Even used, one was worth 50 souls. Allowing for packing weight, his father was selling those Tommy guns for less than a good cafe on Terra got for one drink of Poiktesmi brandy.